Welcome back, everyone. This next session, Skies of Thunder, the deadly World War II mission over the roof of the world. We have an opportunity to hear Dr. Caroline Alexander, author and filmmaker, recount the story of extraordinary human courage where Allied troops overcome the monumental challenge of constructing jungle airfields and then navigating the Hump, the treacherous mountain barrier over the Himalayas that defined the vital air route for supplies to nationalist China from India. Now, in this, the conversation, is with Dr. John Curatola. John is the museum's Samuel Zimmery Stone Senior Historian, a Marine Corps officer of 22 years, joined us from Fort Leavenworth, where he served at the School of Advanced Studies, or Advanced Military Studies, before joining here. John, previous books, Bigger Bombs for a Brighter Tomorrow and Autumn of Our Discontent about air power, but as we heard most recently, his most recent work, Armies Afloat, about the development of amphibious doctrine in the European theater. But John's ideal from this, as a joint officer, but also with significant operational experience, Provide Hope in Somalia, Operation Iraqi Freedom, and then the 2005 Indian Ocean tsunami relief effort. So I think he can appreciate many of the challenges. And with that, John Curatola.
I'm honored here to sit with Caroline Alexander with me today as a person who is a producer, a writer, a filmmaker, a multi-talented, I'll say a Renaissance person in that regard, with so many skills and talents. She's written books on Shackleton's exploration to the Arctic. She's written books on the Bounty. She also did a 2015 treatment of Homer's Iliad. So for those of you who are truly academics, you know, as opposed to dilettantes in the Second World War like I am, she has an impressive achievement in terms of publishing and filmmaking. I'm honored to be with her today in our last session. So thank you for joining us today.
Thank you. Yeah. Thank you.
The first question I want to ask you as we start off today is, tell me a little bit about why you decided to write about hump operations flying over the Himalayas during the war in the China-Burma-India theater.
It's a story I stumbled on. In 2010, I was on assignment for National Geographic magazine on a story about tigers in northern Myanmar. And I was in this spectacular region called the Hukong Valley, which is one of the great tracts of jungle and mountain encircled jungle on Earth, and is now the world's largest tiger reserve. And it's very underpopulated. And up in the furthest north, there were these very attractive small villages of the Naga people, which are built of bamboo, all wood or vegetation materials, except that the vegetable gardens were ringed with jagged metal fences. And so I asked about this tradition, and I was told that the fences had been cut from crashed cargo planes in the jungle. And that was how I first learned about the Hump. And at the head of the valley, you would look out and you would see this low range of the foothills of the Himalayas that I was there in what always seemed to be good weather, but there were always clouds above this ridge. And that feature I learned was sort of in the route that the pilots had flown. So the debris that I was seeing on the ground was the result of one of the great aviation epics of the war. And this was the American determination to supply China by air. China had been blockaded by both land and sea at this point. In 1937, the coasts had been pretty much sealed off by Japan. And in 1942, the Burma Road, which was the last feasible land route, had been taken by the Japanese. And so Roosevelt's fateful words as a personal pledge to Chiang Kai-shek and the Kuomintang and Chinese people was, quote, come what may, unquote, America will supply China, and that really meant by air. And so I became sort of sucked into this story through this very personal, very graphic experience, and sort of, went from there. I think my original plan had been that it would be a story about a single crew, or possibly even an airman, and kind of follow that journey. But this is, I think, one of the most difficult parts about writing this particular story. With nonfiction, it's always very difficult to get context, and particularly when you're someone like me who changes subjects. I add up all my different works, and there's a common theme. I think it's courage and survival and possibly even warfare, but they don't add up to tidy geographical or era. And so I sort of plunge in anew, which is, of course, a great luxury to be able to do that. But context is always the most difficult thing to achieve, because it's very seductive. It's very relatively easy to find interesting details or interesting facts or quirky stories. And when you're a novice to the subject, that's the trail you gravitate to. It's very dangerous. You go to the part you understand. And the context of this, what I saw as a simple story, kept getting wider and wider and wider, because the first thing is, why are we supplying China? What's going on in China? What are the aviation aspects of this? What's going on in the ground? And it just kept getting bigger until there's a point where I sort of felt, okay, I've got my arms as far out as I can around the subject. Now I have to tell the story.
And since you mentioned it, about the story getting bigger and bigger in the China-Burma-India theater and Chiang Kai-shek and the Chinese, can you help paint a picture for us of what's the strategic relevance of this entire theater and of keeping China in the war?
This is a very vexed question. It was vexed at the time, and it's vexed now. I think the tidiest thing for me to do is to cite a remarkable document that was prepared for FDR in February of 1941. So America had been edging towards support for China prior to Pearl Harbor. That China's view, appropriately, is that World War II started in 1931, and they were the first sort of casualties of it. And so America had advanced first $25 million, and now was preparing. Chiang had given indications that he was going to make a kind of separate peace with the Japanese, and so quickly an offer of a $100 million loan was made for Chiang. And Lachlan Curry, who was FDR's financial advisor, was sent out to China in February of 1941 to help advise on how this money would be spent. But it also served as a fact-finding mission. And the memo that he wrote stands really as a blueprint for the strategic purpose of what would unfold. And it's really remarkable I'll try and characterize it. The first thing he says is that he enters almost a police state of great fear, and it's very clear that this is Chiang Kai-shek is a dictator, that people under him live in fear, and that he was never able to have a conversation with two or more Chinese personnel together in the same room. He could only speak one-on-one because people were so afraid that if they spoke, it would be reported. And even when he spoke one-on-one, people would sort of come up and whisper to him because there were spies everywhere. And yet, he then goes on to say that it's very important to Chiang Kai-shek that he be perceived as, that China be perceived as a democracy amongst the nations, and that he had great ambition to sort of want to, he admired Roosevelt greatly and had great ambition to sort of want to be a partner. And he said, I think China's at a crossroads. He can either go and be a brutal dictatorship, fascist dictatorship, or it can go on the path to democracy. And I think we can manage Chiang. And the way we should do that is to have gestures of friendship towards him on the one hand, and this is a quote, and to ensure that, and to say nice things about him, and to ensure that, quote, inspiring, unquote, stories come out about China from Washington. And that's perhaps the most insidious part of it, because it led to a great deal of press manipulation and censorship. But when you pull back from Roosevelt's personal view, one gets the sense that the hump was simply a gesture to Chiang. Here's proof of our goodwill. We are going to supply you. All of the military reports coming back reported on the fact that they could find no active front of nationalist forces fighting the Japanese. And this was a consistent refrain. Nonetheless, the supplies that are being flown over are for military engagement. So there's this tension always from the very get-go. Is this militarily strategic? And if so, what will we do with this China arena? Or is it simply symbolic? Once we commit to this, there are many reasons they start being planned as to how can China serve us? And the first was, we don't want China to collapse because all the Japanese forces there could be released to go to other theaters. Now, this was said so glibly and so often that it's like cold water in your face when you hear the Hump pilots themselves say, wait a minute, how would that work? If Chiang Kai-shek actually said, I'm capitulating, I'm coming with you, my Japanese friends, we will be partners, would Japan just pull out and leave everything to them? Probably not. So there was always this question of how much was being tied down, how strategic was it? Would Chiang really ever surrender his power to the Japanese? But to hedge the bet, let's do this gesture, and maybe we'll find use for it down the line. Maybe we'll do an overland advance through Asia to the Chinese coast. Maybe we'll be doing interdiction programs, air operations from China later, and then later the short-lived B-29 plan, that will bomb the homeland from China and so forth. But that was always a move. The military objectives were sort of a moving target. The solid objective was the symbolic gesture.
And before we get into the lift operations themselves, talking about Chiang and the Kuomintang, there's something else going on domestically in China in the 1930s, in the interwar years, and it begins with a guy named Mao.
It begins with a guy named Mao, although it's really interesting how late in the day in documents concerning this is the China theater, as it were, that comes up. Lachlan Curry in his report, and by the way, Lachlan Curry, I think he became a communist, didn't he, at the end of or years later in the 50s or something. But anyway, here he's supporting the idea of supporting Chiang Kai-shek. But at that point, he says, there should be no mistake that this is not an ideological difference. Chiang fears the communists because they're the only force he hasn't been able to liquidate, buy off, or suppress. But at this point, they're sort of distant noise. They're in the north, they're in Yan'an, they have their own little compound, and they're not mentioned much until really after the Second Burma campaign gets underway and people start thinking maybe the communist forces would fight better than the nationalist forces. Mm-hmm. Maybe we should be working with them as well.
Yeah. And therefore, there's an interesting anecdote I found in my own research that when LeMay starts doing his 20th bombing campaign out of CBI, he actually gives radios to Mao to get weather reports for his crew. So you got the ultimate Cold Warrior working with a commie. Now, there is an ironic piece
I did
right
not
there.
know that.
Yeah,
That's
yeah,
great.
it's a true story. Let's talk a little bit about this part of the world. It's a part that many of us aren't familiar with. The China-Burma-India theater, Southeast Asia. Can you talk a little bit about the geography and the weather?
So so first of all, China, Burma, India stands for, the acronym is CBI, as many of you would know. It was quickly repurposed to stand for Confusion Beyond Imagination, and that's how it was sort of referred to internally. But if one just thinks of the easiest way to get these supplies to China, you want to go from the closest land base, and that was in northeast India. So the northeast Indian province of Assam becomes really the first terminus, two termini, so it became a terminus of the operation. And here, the Americans built a number of air bases which were in the Brahmaputra River Valley, so a kind of wide, flat expanse that was had some kind of sketchy rail and river transport capabilities. And then they're going to stage from there in this direct line to Kunming, which is in Yunnan province, capital of Yunnan province in southwest China. At that time, and even possibly today, the most undeveloped, wild, and by all accounts, spectacularly beautiful parts of China, but extremely rugged. And this was where the Burma Road, the famous Burma Road, had originally ended in Kunming. So it's an aerial Burma Road that we're going to fly. And so the pilots would take off from Assam. They climb over First Ridge, which is about 12,000 feet. And then they fly, if the Crow flies or the C-47 flies, in theory, to Kunming. And then they pass the actual Hump, which is the Kumon Range, which is on the border between modern Myanmar. I'm using the old terminology, by the way. Myanmar is obviously what Burma was. But the terminology, I try to quote as much as possible in the book from documents of the time, and so I have to use the nomenclature of the time as well. And then the highest terrain is sort of on their route, is sort of behind, but they're still very sketchy until they come down into Kunming. So that's the route, and it could be flown safely at 16,000 feet. That would be a safe buffer between the highest peak en route, which is about 14,500, so not a great buffer. But now we come to the real problem, which is that this route also passes not just over terrain, but through weather. And what you have is this unholy collision of weather systems. You have moist, warm air from the Bay of Bengal on the one side, South China Sea, that converge, and then coming down from north from the Tibetan Plateau, from Siberia even, are these cold, icy winds. And they all kind of collide, and then they make also additionally this kind of mountain wave effect slamming against the Himalayas, which cause, I don't know if you've ever been in airplanes that have experienced that, but it can be quite unnerving. Basically, there's nothing you do. You ride up, and then it drops you down. And as long as you drop down to an altitude that's still clear of peaks, there's no problem. But the problem was that these aircraft didn't have that high ceilings. And just to put this in perspective, in May of 2024, a short time ago, you may remember there was a rather dramatic air event over Myanmar when I think it was an Air Singapore flight, but don't quote me on that, but flying from, I believe, London to Singapore, and experienced very severe turbulence over this area. And a passenger was killed and many were injured. And they dropped, it was said, I kept studying it, and they were dropped, I think it was 140-something feet. And I thought, a mere 140 feet? You know, these pilots were dropped thousands of feet, and also remarkably shot up thousands of feet, in some cases higher than the kind of advised ceiling of their own aircraft. And so what you have then is very dangerous terrain because the mountains on either side, on the north side of the route, are higher than the safe altitude on the one hand, but that means that you have to fly you have to carve that route very carefully. And you cannot carve that route very carefully in these kind of roiling wind shears and and also just total lack of visibility, which also brings us to the sort of whole question of navigation. And in the early days, there was one signal, one radio beacon on the course. It was about a 700-something mile course, took about, in perfect weather, with no headwind, about 2.5 to 3 hours to fly. It often took hours longer due to the winds, but the one radio beacon, which was just a signal to kind of give you an orientation off the left wing, was in northern Myanmar, and then it was across the Burma jungle without a single feature and over the mountains. So the danger, the aircraft that I saw ending up in vegetable gardens was a casualty probably of not enemy fire, but having been brought down by weather, or often just got lost and ran out of fuel over the Burma jungle.
Yeah, and you make a great point there about the navigation beacon, the ADF signal on action direction finding. But obviously, as we all know, this is before the days of positive radar control, modern meteorological satellites that would give you up-to-date forecast, and on top of that, you don't have GPS or anything like that as you talk about. And so you're flying to a certain extent blind. Obviously, you can see, but well, sometimes. But there's very little aid to help you, and in your communication, your radio sometimes wouldn't be able to pick up your destination or your departure airfields, and so you're basically on your own once you put the wheels in the well and start your way down the road.
Absolutely, and this was as the operation went on too, there was such a need for pilots within the many theaters. It's hard to underscore how new everything was. I mean, it astounds me. General Hap Arnold, the head of the Army Air Forces, had been trained by the Wright brothers. You know, that's how close in time all this is. And so you're going within a generation a bit to suddenly undertaking this immense airlift over the Himalayas. And so all of the infrastructure just isn't there. It's not just not there, it isn't thought of. And many of the pilots, I mean, as the time goes on and the best pilots, most promising and then the best trained are taken off to be bombers and fighter pilots, these are just cargo pilots. And they were part of the Air Transport Command, and very cruelly it was said by the fighter pilots and bombers that ATC stood for allergic to combat. You know, they were non-combatants. They were truck drivers. All they're doing in the eyes of in the hierarchy of pilots, they're at the bottom of this kind of, the very bottom, and all they are just freight, transport drivers.
Trash haulers.
So, exactly. So these pilots then come in the least trained, and there are reports of some of them coming in with 25 hours of instrument training. So 25 hours of instrument training when you're often in the monsoon season on instruments from takeoff to landing, the whole time, flying across, trying to thread this needle, above these mountains that you can't see and that are somewhere there, extraordinarily stressful, and with really it's more like sailors of old before, when they flew by dead reckoning, when they sailed by dead reckoning. You have a direction, a compass, you have a rough sense of your indicated speed. You don't have enough weather information even to say what wind speeds are, so you kind of reckon, but you're moving, you're in clouds, you can't see landmarks, you have to, it's really hard to imagine.
It has a rather unfortunate name, but it's something that they're using to get themselves from point A to point B. One thing I'd like to bring up too, since you talk about the infrastructure in terms of radar beacons and communications. Something else that people tend to forget is that the pilot and the airplane are only the most visible part of a larger system in terms of maintenance and fuel and parking ramps and everything that you need to support an air fleet. Can you tell us a little bit about those facilities there at the airfields in Assam?
First of all, the men lived in very, very primitive conditions in Assam, and then less primitive, but more taxing perhaps in China. In Assam, they lived in these bamboo and thatch huts with beaten mud floors, and mosquito nets to keep out everything, not just mosquitoes. And, you know, the monsoon coming down the whole time. So these are the living conditions. When the heat of Assam got going, the aircraft got so hot that mechanics' fingers, they'd get second-degree burns on the metal. So they had to work mostly at night. So there's this whole kind of rhythm that's created to try and deal just with the conditions. But you're right, the infrastructure, those are, at a very early stage, navigators were dispensed with. You don't always give a crew on a lot of these transports was the pilot, the co-pilot, and the radio operator. And the radio operator was meant to be the navigator because such signals as there became, it was his job to pick up. So, and he would also sometimes operate as the crew chief. So very much kind of skeleton crews, and these also have to be trained, and these are also rushed out. And really what's remarkable, I was listening to your talk previously about the improvisational talent which seems systemic to the US forces, that there were very few lapses that you could, there are a lot of problems one could point to with the aircraft, there are a lot of problems one can point to later with pilots, for example, being untrained or unwilling to use oxygen and didn't understand that that can affect your thinking. But there really aren't that many problems or shortcomings, faults that one can point to with the aircrew. They seem to be incredibly resourceful and adaptable with very meager supplies to do what they had to do to keep the planes flying.
Let's transition and talk about my favorite topic, the planes themselves.
The planes themselves.
Tell me about the C-47 and the C-87 and the C-46.
So the C-47 was the DC-3, which was a passenger plane. And you will find hymns sung to this aircraft by pilots across the board. American pilots, obviously, the British called it the Dakota, and it's one of the great, I think, creations of aviation, and they can still fly. If, you know, there was recently, I live in Maine, and there was on a D-Day anniversary, a great flight of them came out to fly the old route, you know, to Labrador and so on. And my partner, who's a pilot, was just itching to fly with them. In other words, he would go on one of those planes, whereas he would not have gone on a C-46. So they were very reliable aircraft that had been adapted for transports. They had reinforced floors, they had big doors for cargo, and you know, obviously nothing inside just to carry. Their top speed, it's worth mentioning, or cruising speed was about 160 miles per hour. That's reckoned in miles per hour then, not knots as today. And many of the winds, just to think of that, were in excess of 100 miles an hour. So you get a 100-mile-an-hour wind on your nose, you're not going to be going very far, very fast. So that was the beloved plane that everybody liked. Then the C-46 came in, and this also was an adaptation. It was an adaptation of a passenger plane. But everything went wrong with this aircraft. And it was very much rushed into production because it had a much bigger carrying capacity. was slightly faster, had a higher ceiling. The C-47 ceiling was about 20,000 feet, by the way. You think of those mountain ranges, that's not a lot. And so it was very desirable, in an ideal world to have it working. But amongst the problems that it had was that the wiring on the propeller tended to corrode and cause malfunction, runaway prop, amongst other things. The engines tended to both overheat, which meant that if one engine was lost, then you really couldn't get by. It was a twin-engined aircraft. You were in trouble. It was the other engine was not going to be able to carry that weight. But they also had a tendency not only to overheat, but also to ice up. And this is a very complicated factor of the carburetor system. And if anybody asks this in the Q&A, I'm going to drop my pen and pretend I didn't hear, because I can't. It's been explained to me, but I don't understand it quite. But it was a feature of how the carburetor worked that tended to cause when you were with low pressure, meaning altitude, there was this sort of vapor lock, which meant the engines would just cut off. So the engines would cut off, the engines would ice up, the prop didn't work, and also it had, as the Air Force history said, a tendency to blow up in mid-flight. And so, in fact, the official Air Force history says, and this is a verbatim quote, the plane was a killer, unquote. So these were brought out, I think, in 1943, and very quickly, 20% of them have been lost. Some by losses that could be causes that could be identified, and often the planes just vanished. And then the C-87. The C-87 was the cargo version of the B-24 bomber and should have been a great aircraft. It was, again, had much higher carrying capacity, higher yet, up to 28,000, 30,000 feet, faster, all very desirable, but it had, pilots hated it because it was, first of all, a stiff aircraft. It was a difficult aircraft to lift, to control. And there's a wonderful quote by the writer, Ernest Gann. If none of you, I'm sure many of you will know his very fine memoir, Fatus the Hunter. Mm-hmm. It's one of the best books of memoirs of aviation. Anyway, he wore many hats, and one of them was flying the C-87 in India. And he said the assembly of parts that create the C-87 will never replace the aircraft, was how he put it. And so, but one of its shortcomings, it had a very much touted thin aerodynamic wing.
Davis wing.
The Davis wing. And this wing, by the way, the backstory to this wing is that it had been tested on the actress Norma Shearer's brother's sedan. He had strapped the wing. Somehow he was caught up in the whole process of developing this wing. They'd strapped the wing to the top of his car and driven it at top speed in the back roads of California to see how the airflow went. But anyway, it had but this perfect wing, this perfect laminar airfoil was very much disrupted by ice. Yes. And so ice was one of the major problems over the hump. And so this is why the plane was greatly feared. It was also a 4-engine aircraft, and that was very new and means double the complication. And once again, we come back to the pilots not being the fully trained, cream of their class, as it were, and that this was very daunting to have to come in and take these aircraft.
And the Davis wing was not a very robust structure either. It was prone
to... It flapped, didn't it?
Yes, that's right.
Visibly
it was
flapped.
Prone to, yeah. Here's a great story of a C-87 that's hauling some pilots back from the UK to the United States because they could carry personnel in it as well. And the pilot ran into some weather. They were about 10,000 feet. The pilots were on oxygen, and then they had to climb over the weather, so they go to 12, 13, 14, 15,000 feet, and the pilot forgot he had live humans in the back. Unfortunately, one guy came forward and said, "Hey, you knucklehead, we're dying back here." And some few choice words were exchanged in the story that I heard. But let's talk a little bit about that flight across the hump. You write very vividly about that experience, and I'd like to, if you could.
There's a passage, I think you'd mentioned that might be good to read, so I will take my cue here. So this is as they take off in Assam. There's a great deal before this and a great deal afterwards, but this just gives you a flavor. Ahead lay the runway, black, bordered with uncertain lights and often vanishing into mist. What happened next depended on great part on that particular day's weather and the particular pilot's temperament. If ground fog obscured the end of the runway, there might be delays. To go or not was each pilot's discretion. Meanwhile, jeeps stationed along the positioned aircraft were on alert to clear the runway of any roaming cattle hidden in the mist. Pilot and crew had little idea of what lay ahead beyond the veil of fog and the line of hills immediately before them, as the weather reports they had received from incoming pilots were by now irrelevant. Clear conditions could change within hours into ice-bearing storms, and all that a pilot really knew of the weather was what he saw above his head. And that leads me, I think it would be nice, this is a report of a flight. Those are my words, these are the words of an actual pilot, and so in a sense should be more potent. And there are many of these. A wonderful thing, the Hump Pilots Association was a great source of reminiscences and memoirs and so on, as were privately printed memoirs, or sometimes family members had found their father's diary and privately printed these. So there's a great many of these stories, as well as in Army Air Force's records. 29 September 1943, C-87, number 0555. This aircraft encountered severe icing conditions and dropped from 20,000 feet to 13,000 feet in an uncontrollable descent. This is the pilot's report. The pilot ordered the rest of the crew to bail out. Meanwhile, he struggled to regain control of the gyrating ship, was unable to do so, moved towards the escape hatch. On the way, he saw the navigator lying unconscious on the floor, but was unable to aid him as he fought the centrifugal force which prevented him from leaving the doomed plane. He jumped finally, and as he was drifting down, he saw the plane blow up in midair. Lieutenant Holmes, the pilot, spent 26 days of rain, cold, and hunger in the jungle before arriving at a native village in the Naga Hills. Delirious and physically exhausted, he was led to a food station by the friendly Nagas.
Let's talk about the men. And you used the term in the book called humpitis. And what does that encompass, and what's the connotation there?
So humpitis was the pilot's colloquial term for what we would call, I guess, a kind of PTSD. But it was a recognized psychiatric disorder. In the final year of the Air Force's neuropsychiatric report of the war, there's a special appendix concerning the psychiatric afflictions of pilots who fly the Hump route to China. And this was a collapse, I guess you could say, of morale, of nerves. I mean, it's hard to think the best way I can describe, I'm not a good flyer, by the way. I don't like flying. And I try and, there was one time when I fly with my partner, we have, it's a small plane, and we have a pulse oximeter, which he uses to check that oxygen, he checks everything. This is like the third level of backup. But it also gives you the pulse. And my pulse heading into clouds was 140, just to give you an idea. So I try and transfer that and think of what it would be like to get up every day you had to earn 650 hours to earn your passage home. That adds up to many flights, round-trip flights across the Hump. and you get up and the weather's bad and you know you're going to be on instruments and you know the peaks are there and you know there's nothing you can do about it and you're kind of helpless at the controls. And it just was very, very wearing, and many pilots cracked. And so one way that this was treated was to give, they had rest camps in the jungle, which were meant to be sort of like resort type things where you could go and fish and play volleyball, and it was all very comfortable and so on and so forth. Sometimes it worked, sometimes it didn't. Still the jungle. There were still tigers around. There were still, snakes that came in. But many people just appreciated, if you will, the gesture, the break, the normal activities like doing a few sports and so on and so forth. And so sometimes that worked. When it didn't, there was another resource was to give the pilots sort of ground crew tasks. And this was actually a very cruel thing to do because they were very visible on the base. And it was unclear to me whether it was a punishment or a reprieve, and perhaps a little bit of both. But it marked you as somebody whose nerve had broken and had failed on the one hand, plus you were there as a visible reminder to all the other pilots that there was, good pilots broke, so that wasn't, perhaps that useful. But one of in the psychiatric report is like a distillation of the Hump experience because it itemizes very crisply all the things that cause this crippling fear. Okay, mistrust of the aircraft, mistrust of the weather, the legend of the Hump, because the legend was building and building, and every new pilot who came in was told, oh my God, you won't believe how bad it is, and so on and so forth. But the other thing was the knowledge of the final disposition of the supplies that they were flying to China. And that was a very big question because a lot of them ended up in stores in Kunming. A lot of them ended up on the black market. And an unmeasured amount ended up in Japanese hands where they were traded across the border by various commanders or individuals who were in contact with the Japanese. But there were certainly reports of, for example, medical supplies being flown out that somehow ended up in Shanghai, in Japanese occupied Shanghai. And the pilots used to say that one of the reasons they were so rarely attacked, they lost very few aircraft to enemy attack, I think less than 5%. And most of that occurred in 1 month in October of 1943. Where 12 aircraft were lost, most on the ground. But one of the reasons that the pilots cynically said that they weren't bombed was that it was better for the Japanese that they continue their flight and deliver the goods than not.
That reminds me of a quote from Harry Truman after the war, and he says, providing aid to China is like pouring sand in a rat hole. This way only Harry can say it. I'm going to ask you one more question before we'll go to questions. But you talked about humpitis, and in your book you talk about an individual pilot who refuses to fly.
There's an individual pilot who refuses to fly at night. And this was, it's remarkable. It's one of these, from a research point of view, is a very satisfying story because it was possible to find, I found the commander of the particular airbase was William Barksdale, and it traced his son, who very kindly gave me his father's diary. There was some court-martial reports that gave very detailed accounts of the question and answer and who the other participants were who bore witness. One of those pilots who bore witness had left an oral history in the Museum of the Pacific War, and so it was possible to sort of piece together this kind of small piece of theater. But he had been, he had been a charter pilot of a small plane company, like two-plane company in Palm Beach. And he flew wealthy people here and there, and that was his most experience. And then he'd come into the Army and he was given a job flying a supply route from not across the Hump, but actually from the US to India. And then he comes to the hump, and he makes complaints, and every measure is given to him to sort of take a break, take 2 weeks, then you come back, and he then says, he sort of draws a line, and he says he wants to quit before it's too late. This is his insistence. And he says that he's seen 2 planes blow up in midair. And I believe this is true because it's possible to look the date that this happened and then the kind of tally of known aircraft disasters. And there was at least one I could see that would have been within the timeline, within the place. And so I believe that he may have actually seen it or would certainly have heard of it. And then he puts his foot down and he says, I'll fly, but not at night. And so the court-martial is held. He's found guilty. And he's stripped of his pay, and obviously he's booted out of the army, and he's sentenced to 3 years of hard labor. And I tried to track it from there. I got as far as an appeals case that his wife held, and then the trail kind of runs out, and I leave him in a penitentiary somewhere in upstate New York.
Yeah, he's a guy who obviously doing his duty, but a very dangerous one, and taking its mental and emotional toll on him.
Yeah.
So with that, I think I'm going to open the floor for questions. Jeremy, I will turn it over to you.
We're going to go to the front row to your left, please.
I would assume they had to haul fuel from the takeoff point to the destination to refuel to get back home?
Yes.
What was the efficiency of that haulage? How many gallons of fuel to haul 1 gallon of fuel to refuel?
It was highly inefficient. It took 3 flights to fuel one, to deposit enough for one other flight. And there's a very interesting memo early in this campaign where Roosevelt sort of says he's sort of discussing the number of aircraft that will be allotted to this operation. And then he backtracks and he says he had misread. He transposed the numbers. He thought that 1 flight produced enough fuel for 3 flights, not the other way around. And so then he says, okay, well, we'll need more aircraft. But just that one point shows how very, very difficult this was. And this is just, and as General Arnold says, so once the fuel arrives in Kunming, does it just stay in Kunming? What then? It's meant to be dispersed, and we didn't even get into Claire Chennault's assertion that if you give him the planes in 6 months, he'll be invading Japan, by the way. And that there are all these airfields all ready to go, and that and Arnold says, but to get to the point where you could reach Japan is 1,500 miles away, and there's no ground transport. There's no way to haul the fuel from Kunming to anywhere, and the next airfield that you need is 450 to 750 miles away. How is this going to work? How do we even disperse it? Where's the infrastructure to disperse it? So, and that's even before you get into ideas of sort of bombing campaigns to go on further, where the B-24s were hauling their own fuel over to stockpile. Eventually, they stockpile them in India because they realize it's not safe in China. There's no ground protection in China. But the whole thing is a logistical nightmare in that regard. It's just hauling fuel. And this is something else. It's a good question because you remind me what I should have said. This is aircraft packed, overloaded with aviation gas. And there were, one of the reasons maybe planes blew up in mid-flight were because, sometimes the crew said they could smell the fuel, so they knew that something wasn't right. And all of the crew, they were equipped, if you can believe it, with heaters with open flames in the C-46. So they decided they'd rather be cold than use that. But there were even concerns about using, some of the radio equipment with electrical sparks and so forth. So the answer is it was very inefficient.
And they had the same problem once the B-29s were in theater, trying to
Yeah.
provide enough fuel for that bombing campaign. It's a complete fiasco
Yeah.
trying to get enough fuel there for a fleet.
Next question is to your right, towards the back with Connie, please.
Hi, I really enjoyed your lecture, and I think it's an underrepresented part of the war. I was curious about the type of Lend-Lease Chiang Kai-shek and his army was receiving compared to other nations that were also receiving Lend-Lease, and what proportion of Lend-Lease was the Chinese receiving?
What portion of the
Total Lend-Lease, like what percentage?
Oh.
And what type of specific goods were they receiving?
So of the total land lease, you've stumped me. It's not a large figure given what's going to the British and the Soviets, by the way. But what's remarkable is how the whole picture shifts. So initially, the supplies that are brought in are for China. And it's very vague what is to be done with them. They're given to Chiang Kai-shek on the understanding that he will make use of them. Then we start what I was not able to talk to. I do go into detail in the book, but not able to in the time here, is the Burma campaign, which was essentially an attempt to, a military campaign to cover the building of a new Burma road, another landline to China. And that required a percentage of the supplies that had been sent to China. So General Stilwell claims that percent to run his operation. Then you get Brigadier General Chennault in China with the 14th Air Force that's competing with Stilwell for his supply of the supplies being brought to China. So it's remarkable how what was intended as this kind of gesture with unspecified application as a sign of goodwill devolves into a very vicious struggle by two American generals for their share. And the for China sort of gets very little. And so at that point, you're sort of getting the lion's share goes to eventually to Stilwell, the rest essentially goes to Chennault, and very little is left for much else. In terms of how much gets through, those estimates vary widely. At a minimum, 25% was peeled off to the black market in one way or another, and most estimates are much higher, like over 50%. Some of this was reckoned. The Burma Road, the original Burma Road, was studied quite closely during its time of operation, with people riding it, both British and American, trying to analyze how much was getting through and so on. And it had been seen to be mostly a conduit for black market traffic at that point. So a lot of this knowledge was then, as it were, superimposed on the supply line, the later supply line, both air and the Lido Road to China, sort of trying to figure out how much possibly was getting through.
Next question is going to go to Dr. Mueller in the front here.
Yes, let me just first thank you for what is just a magnificent contribution to understanding the CBI and the Burma theater. It has no wonder that you have so many bestsellers, and this is certainly one of them. And it has an epic and a magisterial quality to it that I found astonishing, especially the assault of the Japanese and the fleeing of the populations away, and it's really a cliffhanger of a story as well as inside the planes. So congratulations to a great work.
Thank you.
Perhaps you could tell this very dramatic story of the flight into see Chiang Kai-shek with Eric Sevareid and the military diplomatic delegation. That's hair-raising story and could have changed the course of the war if you just tell the story. Thank you.
There was, so one of the things that was, this change, did indeed change how some of the dynamics in the theater. So many of you may remember, I hope you know the name Eric Severide means something to this audience, but he was one of the great reporters. His book, there's so many good books that I got to read for this research, but his book, Not So Wild a Dream, which is his memoir, is absolutely fantastic. I mean, he's everywhere. He's in Italy, he's on the Rhine, but he's also, as it turns out, flying to Hump from one of the air bases, the main air base, Chabua, on a beautiful clear day in a C-46, going to Kunming, where he's going to sort of do the obligatory kind of press conference. All the reporters hated it because they were so heavily censored, they couldn't report on what they were, seeing anyway. But anyway, he's there with a delegation. He's got State Department officials. He's got Chinese generals. He's got some civilians. It's a big deal, about 21 passengers. And they are flying on this beautiful day, take off from Chabua, and he's reading his notes. And suddenly one of the flight crew comes back and says, we're going to need you to throw your luggage out the plane. And so his first thought is, my suitcase, my beautiful suitcase that I got in New York before I left. And so he watches in disbelief as just things are thrown out. And then there's a pause, and then the crew chief comes back and says, right, we need all of you to get into your parachutes. And he can't, it's such a good account because this happened all the time. It just didn't happen with such a fine writer who was also a civilian and able to give the general reader a keen appreciation of what this moment would be like. And he watches as people jump out, and he's in utter disbelief. It's like a dream. He can't accept it. The plane is still flying. They're still in the air. It can't be going to happen. He should stay with it. And then finally the plane gives a lurch, and he realizes there's only about 2 or 3 other people in the aircraft, and he dives headfirst out of the aircraft. And he doesn't remember pulling the chute, but he knows he does because he comes, there it is. And he arrives down somewhere in the Burma scrub of the Burma jungle. Everybody jumps out. Everybody survives except the co-pilot. And he watches the plane explode on contact somewhere down below him on a hill. And there they are now in Burma. And one of the good things was that the weather was clear. And this meant other aircraft overflying what was called the aluminum trail at that point, had looked down and seen what had happened, seen the aircraft explode. So the position was noted, and very shortly there was just this flood of goods that were descended from an aircraft that was sent for them. And Severide sort of notes them, it's like 101 pairs of socks, something undershirts. He eventually is getting Agatha Christie novels to read. Just supplies just come pouring down. And in great part, this is because, as you can imagine, the panic back at Chabua, that it's like, oh my God, we've got the most famous reporter in the world, as well as State Department officials, Chinese generals. They've all just jumped out of one of our aircraft. That doesn't look good. And so there's then notes come down. Do not move. You are in one of the hostile Naga areas. Now, the Naga were traditionally headhunters. And during the British had suppressed that practice as well as human sacrifice, but they'd not suppressed it so well that there weren't relics around. So you could go to villages, and there are pictures of this time, where All the skulls are hung outside the houses. Interestingly, you didn't have to be an enemy to have your head taken. You just needed to be somebody. So women and children were often taken, and slaves were sacrificed, the head taken. That's just an anthropological footnote. But anyway, so Severide, so now suddenly Don Flickinger is this remarkable medic, parachutes in to take charge of them. He sort of comes down from heaven. And he starts delegating. You're in charge of supplies. Severide, you keep a log, you do this. And everybody feels more secure with this presence. But basically, they're told to just wait because the Saba of Mokdang is going to come out and lead them out. And so they wait. And finally, the Sahib of Mokdang strolls out. He's a young British political officer who's dressed in shorts and a powder blue polo shirt with a long cigarette holder, and has made the 85-mile march over up and down terrain, within a remarkably short period of time. And he's got something like 400 bearers at his back who are going to sort of help get them out. He's also brought his, Severide says he resembles the actor Leslie Howard, so we sort of have this image. And so anyway, they're led out over 2 weeks through very rough terrain, finally come in, and then at when they finally get into India and sort of safe harbor, they're met by this flock of American press agents. And Severide, who's sort of on crutches and very thin at this point, says, the adventurous spirit of American journalism has not been lost, because he was quite scathing about these people who sort of rolled out for the big story at the end. But anyway, the practical outcome of this was that suddenly the U.S. Army Air Forces realized there was a big problem with people bailing out. There had always been a big problem with people bailing out. And now they needed to set up a dedicated search and rescue team. The first search and rescue team had kind of been an ad hoc group. They were the Detachment 101 that you've heard of in one of the other talks, who had been sent to go in behind Japanese lines. They were the precursor of the OSS, and this was their first mission actually in Burma. And they had arrived and realized when they arrived that they had spy cameras and all kinds of spyware, but they didn't speak any language, didn't know there were different dialects, didn't know the people, didn't know the terrain. So there was a period of sort of being a little out of their depth. And also they had no aircraft to go behind enemy lines. They're meant to be dropped behind enemy lines, and nobody had assigned them an aircraft. And so they made an offer to the Army, which is that if you give us one plane, if you give us one, I think it was C-47, we will look for downed airmen. And they reckoned that they saved 25 to 35% of airmen who were down. And that was with one plane, one little group whose main job was meant to be operating behind the Japanese lines, but this was kind of a sideline. And that's all there had been. And so finally, after the so-called Severide story, as it was called, there's a dedicated search and rescue unit. And that provided great peace of mind to the airmen, just knowing that there were people geared, volunteering, geared, ready to go out and look for them.
And that's just one of the great stories in Skies of Thunder by Caroline Alexander. Thank you, John. Thank you, Caroline. So now we finish our time here in the Arcadia Ballroom of the Higgins Hotel. Please do bring all of your gear with you. For those of you who are Patriot Circle members, thank you for your support, and our reception is beginning right now. Over in the stage door canteen, you will enter the museum campus through the firehouse doors. Tonight, for the closing banquet, we will open doors at 6:15, and you will also enter through the firehouse exit. Let's join Caroline and John over at the book signing table. And for you Patriot Circle members, see you at the reception. 5 o'clock for that. Thank you.